Hello, genealogists. It's Craig again from Just Genealogy. Today, I thought we'd talk about the Selective Service System in World War I. The first thing I would do if I was working with the Selective Service System in World War I is that I would go to archives.gov and read what has been written in the military records section on World War I draft registration cards. It will provide you with an introduction to them, their historical background, all that kind of information that will get you placed in the right context for dealing with these records. Early in the war, it was possible to volunteer, either Army, Navy, Marines, Coast Guard. You could volunteer. But eventually it was determined that the volunteer system was interfering with the needs of the military, meaning that the Army needed people, the Marines not so many people, and the Navy actually not so many people, but everybody was joining the Navy and Marine Corps to get out of going into the Army by that time. The way things usually work is the people who want to fight early on in a war get involved in the war before their draft even occurs. And then people who are less interested in fighting need to be drafted, and therefore they were trying to avoid dying in Europe. So Pershing and the rest of the military determined that, well, this draft system is not working for us. We're going to have to fix it so that you can't enlist anymore. You must be drafted, and the needs of the military will determine whether you end up in the Army, the Navy, or the Marine Corps. Now, remember that these drafted people were members of the National Army. So we have to remember that in the beginning of the war, there were three sources. There was the regular army that you could enlist in, there was the National Guard that you could enlist in, and then there was the National Army that you have to be drafted into. Pershing at some point decided, we're not going to have this three army thing. We're all one US Army, and that's how we're going to deal with it. So it is not going to exist in any other way except as the United States Army. So what would happen would be is people would be drafted and they would end up in regular Army units, they would end up in National Guard units, or they would end up in National Army units, but it didn't make any difference anymore. Drafted people ended up in all three sources. How it basically worked out was that 13% of the regular Army was drafted, 10% of the National Guard was drafted, and 77% of the National Army were draftees. This is how it all works out. Largely, if you got drafted, you ended up in those divisions that were 80 and higher. But there was a chance that you would end up in the 20s and 30s, and there was a chance that you would end up in the single digits and teens. But most of them are going to end up in the 80s and the 90s. So when we look at registration periods and look at the numbers, this came out of the Center for Military History publications in series 23 that I've talked about in the past. They talk about the various registrations and how many people were in fact registered in each, what percentages actually ended up in the military. And then it also talks about African-American registrants and Native American registrants also. This is what it would have been like if the distinction between the services had been removed by Pershing on 7 August 1918. Each of the three registrations used a slightly different version of the draft registration card based on the questions that were being asked. For example, in the first registration, they asked if you were bald or not. I have yet to figure out why they asked why you were bald. But in general, the registration cards included full name, home address, date and place of birth, age, race, country of citizenship, occupation and employer, a physical description, and additional information such as address of nearest relative, dependent relatives, marital status, father's birthplace, or previous exemption from service. Now, a lot of individuals who had prior service didn't bother to mention that they had prior service. My own great-grandfather had prior service but he didn't bother to mention it on his World War I draft card, which occurred about 8 or 9 years after he had finished his service. The law was passed on 19 May 1917, and it was subsequently amended, and it mobilized all men from 18 to 45. So pretty much anybody by the third draft, at 45, that's how it looked. The records are found in Record Group 163, records of the Selective Service System, World War I, 1917 and 1939. And there's a microfilm publication, M1509, World War I Selective Service System draft registration cards. Now, because these have been microfilmed, they easily ended up on Ancestry. So these World War I draft registration cards are on Ancestry. And here I'm searching for Roland Roberts, who is from the state of Virginia. He is my great-grandfather. And here is his card. It shows that Roland Woody Roberts lives on Ford Avenue in Lynchburg, Virginia. He's 36 years old. He was born 20 October 1881. He's a molder working at the Lynchburg Foundry in Lynchburg, Virginia. And his nearest relative is Sadie U. Roberts, living at that same address. And then it has his signature. And it provides his color of eyes, color of hair. And so you have a front and a back. So the left-hand side is the front of the card, the right-hand side is the back of the card. In looking at these draft cards, you want to see what kind of form it is, because then you'll know what date that the individual is being drafted from. So the first draft, Form 1, is 5 June 1917, and it's for 21 to 30-year-olds. And 9.5 million people were part of this draft. About 25% of them, or 22.4 million, were in fact inducted. The next draft was a year later, and again, it was for 21 to 30-year-olds, but only about 736,000 were actually eligible. And then they added another one a month later that added another 158,000. So basically all that really changed is the 20-year-olds now were 21, and they inducted about 25% of those. That it was also a cleanup for those that they missed up until the 30s, meaning age 30. And then 12 September 1819, there was an 18 to 21-year-old draft and a 31 to 45-year-old draft, which basically extended the catchment area a month later to everybody else. But they only inducted 1% of those, or 120,000 out of 13 million. And the reason for that is that by November of 1918, the war is over. So a total of 24 million men plus were registered. 2.8 million were inducted into the military. And again, that first registration, 25% of those were inducted. And then the second registration were just those that had turned 21 since the last registration. And there were 2 of those. And then the third registration, again, only 1% were inducted, although it was a much larger catchment area. So 48% of the total male population was actually registered. 18% in the first registration, 2% in the second, 25% in the third, 3% were already in the service when the first registration occurred, and 52% were not registered. Now, the reason that 52% were not registered is these are people, it's total male population, so it's people under the age of 18 eventually, and those over the age of 45. From the perspective of officers, there are about 200,000 commissioned officers required by the Army. And at the beginning of the war, only about 9,000 were actually in federal service in either the Army or the National Guard. So they needed to go and get those folks also. Physical exams were part of the draft board process. Its purpose was to reject registrants who were not physically sound enough for military life. individuals who are not sound enough for military life are a burden on the military, and you just can't use them like you would want to. A good example is someone with asthma, someone who's missing all their teeth, someone who doesn't have all their fingers. Those kind of things would prevent military service. Missing a limb is an example. However, when they would get to the recruit camps, there would be further examination, which might result in their rejection for service because of defects not found at the local boards. It turned out that the healthiest registrants were in fact from the Midwest, farm boys. Agricultural rather than industrial folk were the largest number of registrants, and the number of recently arrived immigrants actually was not that large in how things finally ended up. It turned out that 100,000 country boys would furnish 4,790 more soldiers than an equal number of city boys by the time it was all said and done and following their registration. The draft registration boards, there is a microfilm publication, M1860, and years ago there was a book that also described these things, boundary maps of selected cities and counties for the draft registration boards where there was more than one draft registration board in a city. So for example, in Alabama, Birmingham had more than one draft registration board, as did Los Angeles and San Diego, Denver, Bridgeport, Hartford, New Haven. Basically, the big towns, the big cities might have more than one draft registration board. This microfilm publication provided maps for where those boards actually were. And you can see a good number of cities. I always recommend that you go and get that World War I Selective Service record as quickly as possible when you have anybody born after about 1875 and 18 years old in 1820. That's a little bit larger than it has to be, but I'm still going to go and look for them in that time period because my experience is that people lie about their age. I also recommend that at the same time, you go and get, if they're living during the World War II era, 1940 to 1945, that you also go and get their World War II Selective Service records. Now, this is known as the old man's draft in World War II. And we'll talk about the World War II Selective Service at some other time. But I just want to remind you that if you get somebody's World War I draft card and they're living in 1940, you want to go and get their 1940 draft card too, so you can see what's different. And if we look at Roland Woody Roberts, he's now living in Halifax, Virginia, instead of Lynchburg. He's running a foundry there. Or by this time, he may have been a farmer. But one of the two things. Gives place of birth there in Wythe County, gives his date of birth, which is the same. He's now 60 years old. It's kind of old for the draft, you know? And now his wife is not Sadie U. Roberts, but Mrs. Emily Roberts, also of Halifax, and he's employed by himself. So you want to make sure to get both Selective Service records. So this has been Craig with Just Genealogy, converting people doing genealogy into genealogists day by day. Just a little quick one today. They're easy to find on Ancestry, both the World War I and the World War II cards. Always go and get them. You'll never know what they'll tell you. Thank you all so very much. We're almost to 250 subscribers. We've had over 2,000 views. We're moving right along. Appreciate you very much. Please subscribe if you haven't done so already. And we'll talk to you tomorrow.